You think you understand betrayal in theory until it walks up to you in real life, wearing someone else's confidence, pretending to be some righteous hero sent to save a woman who's been deceiving you for years. That's how my story truly began. Not with an argument, not with a confession, but with the sudden realization that my life had already been rewritten without my consent. By the time I understood what was happening, everything had already collapsed, and I was left piecing together fragments of memory, anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. I had always been the kind of person who observed other people's stories from a distance, reading about their disasters and heartbreaks like they were cautionary tales meant for someone else. I never imagined I would become one of them. Looking back now, I can't even pinpoint the exact moment my marriage died, because decay is quiet. It doesn't explode. It erodes. It softens the foundation slowly until one day the structure simply gives way. By the time everything surfaced, it felt less like shock and more like confirmation of something my instincts had been whispering for years. The end didn't come with clarity or closure. It came with confusion, rage, and a strange sense of relief that I was no longer trapped in uncertainty. Everything that followed felt unreal, like watching someone else's life unfold while standing in my own body, unable to stop it. At the time everything unraveled, I was in my late 30s, and my wife was just a year younger than me. We had been together for close to a decade and a half in total, married for most of it, with 2 young children who were still innocent enough to believe their world was unbreakable. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but it wasn't a nightmare either, at least not in the beginning. We had built routines, shared responsibilities, inside jokes, and long-term plans. But somewhere along the way, the warmth disappeared and was replaced with distance that couldn't be explained by stress or exhaustion alone. Conversations became short, affection became rare, and intimacy became something that felt awkward rather than natural. I tried to fix it the only way I knew how: communication, patience, effort. But every attempt felt like talking to a wall. The person I was married to became emotionally unreachable, physically present but mentally absent. It was like living with a stranger who shared my house, my children, and my history, but not my life. I told myself relationships go through phases, that love changes form, that not everything is supposed to feel intense forever. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't evolution. It was abandonment without departure. There had been a period earlier in our marriage when I struggled professionally, and for a while she carried the financial weight of the household. I blamed everything on that. I convinced myself that resentment had grown, that respect had faded, that maybe she never saw me the same way again after that phase of vulnerability. But when I got back on my feet and things stabilized, nothing improved. The distance stayed. The coldness stayed. The indifference stayed. Celebrations felt forced, shared moments felt empty, and silence filled every space where connection used to live. Even when good things happened in my life, she reacted like a coworker, not a partner. Our home felt functional, not loving, like a place of logistics rather than intimacy. The hardest part wasn't the arguments, because we barely even fought. It was the absence of emotion altogether. No passion, no jealousy, no affection, no curiosity, just coexistence. I watched the marriage die slowly and quietly, and I stayed anyway because of the children, because of history, because of hope, and because walking away felt like failure. I told myself I could fix it if I just tried harder, if I just loved more, if I just endured longer. Eventually, I stopped trying as hard, not because I stopped caring, but because I ran out of energy. You can't carry a relationship alone forever. I still loved her, but I began to detach emotionally as a form of survival. I accepted less, I expected less, I hoped less. The house became quieter. The emotional distance became normal. And then one day, something inside me broke, and I said the word I had been afraid of for years: separation. I expected tears, anger, fear, something, anything. What I got was indifference. Her response was calm, detached, almost relieved. It was like I had just suggested rearranging furniture instead of dissolving a family. That moment hurt more than any argument ever could. It wasn't rejection, it was apathy. I pushed for answers, explanations, accountability, reasons. I wanted something to fight against. But there was nothing. No confession, no clarity, no emotion, just emptiness. And somehow that emptiness was louder than any scream. When the legal process started, it felt procedural, not emotional. Papers, signatures, deadlines, meetings. It all felt sterile compared to the emotional chaos inside me. She suddenly became more communicative than she had been in years, but only about logistics. It was transactional, not human. It was like dealing with a business partner instead of a spouse. I delayed signing anything, not as revenge, but because I still didn't understand what had happened to us. I wanted answers before closure. I wanted truth before endings. But truth doesn't always come from the people who owe it to you. Sometimes it comes from strangers who don't care how much damage they cause when they deliver it. The truth arrived in the form of a man I had never met, pulling up near me one day and speaking to me like he had a right to my life, my marriage, and my decisions. He didn't threaten me directly, but his presence alone was a message. He spoke with confidence, entitlement, and a sense of superiority that made my blood boil. He told me to let her go, to stop delaying, to move on, as if I were an inconvenience in his story rather than the person whose life he had intruded into. I didn't need him to say it outright. I knew exactly who he was. No stranger speaks like that unless they've been invited into the narrative. In that moment, every unanswered question suddenly had a face. The emotional distance, the indifference, the coldness, the sudden willingness to end everything. It all made sense. The betrayal didn't shock me as much as I expected. It explained me. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She didn't apologize, she didn't cry, she didn't justify it. She simply treated it like an inconvenient detail rather than a devastating truth. That hurt more than the affair itself. Not the betrayal, but the lack of remorse, the lack of accountability, the lack of humanity. In that moment, I realized I didn't lose a wife. I lost a person who had already left long ago. Signing the divorce papers didn't feel like surrender. It felt like release. I stopped fighting for something that no longer existed. I stopped chasing someone who had already chosen someone else. I stopped trying to repair something that was already gone. The separation that followed was quiet, lonely, and heavy. Living alone after years of family noise felt unnatural. The silence was loud. The space was empty. The absence of my children half the time felt like grief on a schedule, but I adapted. I rebuilt routines. I created a new version of normal. I focused on being present when my kids were with me and stable when they were. I didn't poison them with my pain. I didn't involve them in adult bitterness. I carried my anger privately and my responsibility publicly. I watched another man step into a role that used to be mine, and I swallowed the resentment because my children deserved peace more than I deserved revenge. But peace didn't last. Insecurity, ego, and unresolved chaos have a way of resurfacing. Social media posts turned into accusations. Innocent moments turned into imagined threats. Jealousy replaced indifference. The same woman who once didn't care if I existed suddenly cared who I stood next to in photos. And then it escalated. What started as silent tension turned into confrontation, and confrontation turned into violence. One night in front of my home, that same man showed up again, not with words this time, but with intimidation, aggression, and a weapon in his hand. He didn't come as a partner. He came as a threat. He came to assert dominance, control, and fear. And for the first time, I saw exactly who he was, not a protector, not a savior, not a hero, but a volatile, unstable man who mistook aggression for strength. The situation spiraled fast. Fear turned into chaos. Chaos turned into police lights, and within minutes the fantasy collapsed. The self-proclaimed protector became a criminal in handcuffs. The loyal partner became someone interfering with law enforcement. The illusion of stability they had tried to build shattered in public. Charges were filed. Records surfaced. Reality arrived. And suddenly, everything that had been hidden behind arrogance and entitlement was exposed for what it truly was. Not love, not protection, not honor. Just dysfunction, violence, and delusion. That moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that walking away had saved me and, more importantly, had protected my children from a future that would have been built on instability, fear, and chaos. The aftermath of that night didn't feel dramatic the way movies make chaos look. It felt slow, heavy, administrative, and emotionally draining. Police reports, court documents, statements, phone calls, and meetings replaced the noise of confrontation. What lingered most wasn't fear, it was clarity. For the first time since my marriage began to decay, everything finally made sense. The emotional withdrawal, the cold detachment, the sudden confidence in ending the relationship, the indifference toward our family, all of it aligned into a single truth. I had been living in the shadow of a decision that had already been made long before I was informed. I wasn't abandoned in a moment. I was replaced over time. And understanding that changed how I processed the pain. It stopped being about loss and started being about liberation. I wasn't grieving a marriage anymore. I was grieving an illusion. The person I thought I was married to no longer existed, if they ever truly did, in the way I believed. What hurt wasn't losing her. It was realizing how long I had been loyal to someone who had already emotionally exited my life. That realization is brutal, but it's also clarifying. It cuts through confusion and replaces it with acceptance, even if that acceptance is painful. The legal consequences that followed were not just about accountability, they became about protection. Once records surfaced and patterns were revealed, the focus shifted away from adult conflict and toward child safety, and that changed everything. For the first time since the separation, the system that often feels cold and impersonal began working in a way that felt justified, not vengeful, protective. I wasn't motivated by revenge. I wasn't seeking punishment. I was seeking stability. I was seeking safety. I was seeking predictability for my children's lives. Because when adults implode, kids absorb the damage quietly. They don't always speak it, but they carry it. And I refused to let my children grow up in an environment shaped by volatility, intimidation, and emotional instability disguised as romance. I had already failed to protect the marriage. I wasn't going to fail to protect my kids. That became my anchor, my purpose, my direction. Everything else, anger, bitterness, resentment, became secondary to that mission. Emotionally, I went through phases that felt contradictory. Some days I felt relief. Some days I felt rage. Some days I felt emptiness. Some days I felt gratitude. Healing isn't linear, it's chaotic. One moment you feel free, the next you feel broken. One day you feel strong, the next you feel hollow. But slowly the weight began to lift. Not because the story changed, but because I changed how I carried it. I stopped asking why and started focusing on what now. I stopped trying to understand her choices and started defining my own future. I stopped replaying the past and started rebuilding the present. And in that rebuilding, I found something unexpected: peace. Not happiness, not joy, not excitement, peace. Quiet, stability, emotional stillness. The kind of peace that doesn't come from everything being perfect, but from everything being honest. I no longer lived in confusion. I no longer lived in emotional contradiction. I no longer lived in denial. Reality, even when painful, is easier to live in than illusion. My relationship with my children deepened in ways I didn't expect. When you lose half your time with them, you gain intensity in the time you have. Moments matter more. Conversations matter more. Presence matters more. I became more intentional, more patient, more emotionally available. I learned how to sit in silence with them, how to listen without fixing, how to support without controlling. I wasn't trying to replace what they lost. I was trying to strengthen what they still had. And in that process, I healed parts of myself that had nothing to do with the divorce. I became more grounded, more self-aware, more emotionally regulated. The chaos forced growth. The pain forced introspection. The collapse forced reconstruction. Sometimes destruction is the only path to transformation. I also learned a hard truth about ego and identity. Betrayal doesn't just break trust, it breaks self-image. You start questioning your worth, your awareness, your value, your intuition. You replay moments, conversations, decisions, and wonder how you didn't see it. You wonder how you missed the signs. You wonder if you were naive, blind, foolish. or just in love. And eventually you realize something important. Betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. Deception requires a lack of integrity. Distance requires emotional detachment. Infidelity requires rationalization. None of that reflects your value, it reflects their character. That realization doesn't remove the pain, but it removes the shame. And shame is often the heaviest part of betrayal. When that lifts, healing becomes possible. The man who tried to intimidate me didn't just represent her betrayal, he represented the illusion she had chosen, the fantasy version of strength, the performance of protection, the costume of confidence. But when pressure came, the mask fell. True character always reveals itself under stress. Real strength doesn't need intimidation. Real confidence doesn't need dominance. Real protection doesn't come from aggression. What I saw wasn't heroism, it was insecurity weaponized. And watching that illusion collapse reinforced something powerful in me. I didn't lose to a better man. I was replaced by a louder one, a more chaotic one, a more unstable one. And that's not a competition worth winning. Over time, anger softened into understanding, not understanding of her choices, but understanding of my journey. I stopped needing validation from her. I stopped needing closure from her. I stopped needing acknowledgement. Closure didn't come from her, it came from my acceptance. It came from my boundaries. It came from my growth. It came from my refusal to carry her chaos into my future. The story stopped being about betrayal and started being about rebuilding, about redefining myself, about redefining fatherhood, about redefining relationships, about redefining peace. I wasn't trying to return to who I was before, I was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone calmer, someone clearer. I also learned how fragile identity can be when it's built around roles. Husband, provider, partner, protector. When those roles collapse, you either collapse with them or you evolve beyond them. I chose evolution. I stopped defining myself by what I lost and started defining myself by what I was building: stability, consistency, emotional safety, integrity, presence, purpose. Those became my new foundations. And ironically, losing my marriage clarified my values more than any success ever had. Loss has a way of stripping away illusion and leaving only truth behind. The narrative I once carried, about loyalty, sacrifice, endurance, changed. I realized that staying isn't always strength and leaving isn't always failure. Sometimes staying is fear and leaving is courage. Sometimes endurance is self-betrayal and separation is self-respect. Love without mutual effort isn't love, it's attachment. Commitment without reciprocity isn't devotion, it's dependency. And marriage without honesty isn't partnership, it's performance. Understanding that reframed everything. It reframed my past, my present, and my future. Now when I look back, I don't feel hatred. I don't feel revenge. I don't feel obsession. I feel distance, emotional distance, psychological distance, narrative distance. That chapter no longer defines me. It shaped me, but it doesn't own me. It taught me, but it doesn't trap me. It hurt me, but it didn't destroy me. And that's the part I'm most proud of. Not that I survived betrayal, but that I transformed through it. That I didn't become bitter. That I didn't become cruel. That I didn't become cold. That I didn't let pain turn me into someone I didn't recognize. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some don't end with forgiveness. Some don't end with closure. Some end with separation, boundaries, and silence. And that's okay. Not every ending needs redemption. Some endings are simply escape. Some endings are simply survival. Some endings are simply freedom. Mine wasn't poetic. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't romantic. It was real, messy, ugly, painful, human. But it gave me something priceless: clarity, peace, and the chance to rebuild a life that no longer depends on someone else's honesty to function.